Okay, for the next 45 minutes, I am very honored. We're going to skip a few of the breaks for PrisonPlanet.tv viewers and Infowars.com stream listeners because this is too important information and the time we have left. If I went over Professor Boyle's bio, it would take hours, but he's written international weapons, bioweapons conventions. He's been a top-level analyst for the federal government in that capacity. It just goes on and on with his lengthy bio. And last time he was on with us, I guess about a year and a half ago, an article that Steve Watson wrote about it was published in scores of newspapers and one of the largest magazines in the country and some foreign newspapers as well, dealing with the fact that he was saying the anthrax was an inside job. Now I've got my mother-in-law that doesn't even believe my show calling up thinking the government did it. She'll be put on the list now, I'm sure. Now I've got just all over everyone saying it's complete bull. Mainstream media is saying it's complete bull. You look at the whole story. They grabbed this other patsy, put him in the hospital, murder him clearly, then say that he was always who they knew did it while they persecuted Stephen Hatfield. We have this other guy, Dr. Philip Zach, breaking in to the bioweapons lab when he didn't even work there, not getting in trouble, still at another bioweapons lab. It's the most weaponized U.S. anthrax ever seen. The FBI destroys the original samples so that it can't be proven, and so they can claim that this Dr. Ivans cooked it up in his bathtub or in a basement. Just the miniaturization process takes over $100 million worth of equipment. It's the size of a gymnasium. It just goes on and on, but we have a bioweapons expert on with us. Sir, I know you don't like talking about yourself, but we're about to break. Will you give us some of your background, though, and your expertise on this and your bold stance a year and a half ago that's now being echoed by people at Fort Detrick saying Ivans couldn't have done this, and, you know, as the plot really thickens and as their cover-up implodes?
Right. Well, the day the technology on the Daschle letter was revealed in the New York Times, I immediately called Marion Spike Bowman, who is a high-level counterintelligence official at the FBI, and in fact, it turns out was also the person who spiked the FBI's warrant for the Moussaoui computer. But that's another issue.
But before we go, tell folks who you are.
Oh, well, I'm getting to that. He knew me because I had drafted the United States Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989 that was passed unanimously by both houses of the United States Congress and signed into law by President Bush Sr. That legislation was the U.S. domestic implementing legislation for the Biological Weapons Convention, and Mr. Bowman and I had met each other at a terrorism conference at the University of Michigan Law School. In any event, I told Mr. Bowman, this was in October of 2001, that the only people who had the capability to do this would be those individuals working at either United States government labs or private contractors and things of this nature, and that it obviously seemed to me this was U.S. government related. He took the information down and said he would pass it on to the appropriate people handling the investigation. I hung up. And then it occurred to me that I had a complete list of who all these people were and what these labs were, going back to my work on getting the legislation through.
Absolutely. So, we're gonna skip this break for stations out there, and then just come right back into the main segment in 4 minutes with our guest, really top bioweapons expert, helped write some of the major international treaties for the United States, Francis A. Boyle, and we are continuing, skipping this break. Okay, Mr. Boyle, continue.
Oh, sure. So I called him back, and I said, I have a complete list here of when the program was in the public record, and here's some of the names and some of the facilities, and I went through not all of it, but I went down the list, and I told him where he could get this list, And then I said, and it's also been reported this summer that the CIA was engaged in anthrax work as well. You could get the CIA list from the CIA. And then, we talked some more, and he said, well, the FBI was working with Fort Detrick. And I said, well, Fort Detrick could very well be the problem here, that you had someone like a Timothy McVeigh who was once on the reservation and now off the reservation. So he said again he would communicate this to the people in charge of the investigation.
Instead, they ran around everywhere saying that it was somebody in a bathtub or in a bucket making it, and now we know the White House ordered Robert Mueller to say it was Iraq, that it was Al-Qaeda, and boy, that really shows them being complicit. But please continue.
Well, it was even worse than that, Alex, in that at that point, I had assumed good faith on the part of the FBI in this investigation because, it had killed several people. It had shut down the United States Congress, which I think was probably the greatest political crime ever inflicted on our republic in its history. But then I read that the FBI had authorized the destruction of the U.S. government's Ames strain collection in Ames, Iowa. Ames strain was the strain responsible for U.S. biowarfare programs. Everyone knew that. And indeed, that's all now been confirmed. You can read it in today's New York Times. There's a story right in there.
And of course, we all said this 6.5 years ago, but we're still kooks.
Right. So when I read the FBI had destroyed the entire Ames strain collection in Ames, Iowa, I knew a cover-up was underway because you could have taken, the FBI, legitimate scientific researchers could have taken that collection and used it to genetically reconstruct precisely where and when and how the weapon came from. And they destroyed it. This was clearly a federal crime in its own right, destruction of justice. So it was obvious that evidence all should have been preserved as evidence of a crime. I used to teach criminal law here, so it was obvious they were covering up and covering up ever since. Indeed, if you read today's New York Times, they also come up with this statement. They admit that Ivins submitted a culture to them, which they promptly destroyed. So there you have yet again another instance of destruction of evidence, obstruction of justice by the FBI.
And as hurriedly as they could. Okay, we're going to come back in with some stations joining us to continue right now with our guest.
What would you do if you knew all the things we knew? Would you stand up for truth? Or would you turn away too?
Francis Boyle is a professor of international law at the University of Illinois College of Law. He's a graduate of the University of Chicago and Harvard Law School. He's also received a Ph.D. in political science from Harvard University. And he has just had a bio it's too long to go over, but he's written international bioweapons conventions for the federal government, advised Congress, written some of the biggest publications out there. The list just goes on and on. He's currently a member of the Nobel Prize for Governor George H. Ryan Committee. Okay, continuing, sir, with the FBI covering up this evidence, covering up the original Ames strain, destroying them. Then they find other samples that other people had that they gave them. They destroy it immediately. You're saying crimes, obstruction of justice. Why are they covering it up? Well, then we have the White House on Cipro, the anthrax-fighting antibiotic, weeks before the anthrax letters show up, admitting that arrogantly. We have political enemies of the Bushes getting it. They use it as a smokescreen to pass the Patriot Act. They're pressuring the FBI, now public, ordering them to say Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda did it. I mean, this is the most open and shut case ever for the federal government, criminal elements of it, launching the anthrax attack. Then you have the cover-up, the patsies. I mean, break that down for us.
Yeah, I think it's all clear. On the first weekend in November, I went out to Harvard, where I was running a workshop on biological weapons, and I publicly stated at the time that, in my opinion, my professional opinion, it was either elements of the United States government itself or contractors working for the United States government that was behind the anthrax attack. And my colleague at the time, Professor Jonathan King of MIT, who's a microbiologist and runs their electron microscope lab, independently said the exact same thing I did. And I gave interviews on Fox and the BBC and Pacifica